Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. And if you wouldn't mind removing your mask for testimony, if you feel comfortable doing so. And let's begin by having you state your full name, spelling each of your names.
My name is Daniel, D-A-N-I-E-L, Eisenschmid, I-S-E-N-S-C-H-M-I-D.
Ms. Aldridge.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Where do you work?
I work at NMS Labs, Horsham, Pennsylvania.
Did you say in Horsham, Pennsylvania?
Yeah.
How long have you been with NMS Labs?
Since 2011.
What do you do at NMS Labs?
I'm a forensic toxicologist at NMS.
And did you have any other lab experience before joining NMS?
Yes, I did. Prior to joining NMS from 1994 to 2011, I was the chief toxicologist for the Wayne County, Michigan Medical Examiner's Office. And before that, I was at Southgate Medical Lab, so I was the director of toxicology. And prior to that, from 1982 to 1991, I was at Maryland Medical Labs in Baltimore, Maryland. Also during that period, working at some time during the, I think it was from 84 to 86 at the Medical Examiner's Office in Baltimore as well.
So rewinding a bit as well to your educational background, could you just describe for the jury what your educational background is?
Sure. I have a bachelor's degree in biology from Adelphi University in Garden City, New York, and that was attained in 1982. Then I have a master's degree in forensic pathology with pathology with a concentration in forensic toxicology, and that's from University of Maryland at Baltimore. That was in 1986. And then my PhD was from University of Maryland at Baltimore in forensic toxicology in 1991.
Do you have any specialized certifications related to your work?
I am board certified as a fellow from the American Board of Forensic Toxicology.
And what are the requirements for that?
So the requirements for that, they've changed over the years, but for the fellow requirement, you can apply to the board after 3 years after you have your PhD. They examine your credentials to see that you're active in the field of forensic toxicology. If you have the right references and you're active in the field, they'll allow you to sit for an examination. And then if you pass the examination, the board votes on your final certification. After that, you have to do continuing education each year and attain a minimum number of continuing education credits. And then every 5 years, you have to apply to the board for reaccreditation.
And have you gone through all those requirements and satisfied them successfully?
Yes, I have.
And are you up to date with all of those continuing education requirements as well?
I am.
I'm going to get back to sort of your role as a forensic toxicologist. Could you describe sort of your day-to-day job duties as a forensic toxicologist at NMS Labs?
So my primary responsibility at NMS Labs is to do case review. And what that means is when toxicology tests are performed at NMS Labs, particularly ones that require many different kinds of tests to be done, they wind up being reviewed by a toxicologist or a certifying scientist to look at them in the context of all the testing that was done. So individual tests are reviewed by analysts in the laboratory, and they're secondary reviewed as well. But the final review comes to either a toxicologist or certifying scientist that looks at everything in the context of the entire case.
And then in that capacity, is it part of your job duties to author reports and sign off on all of that testing?
Yes, it is.
Approximately how many cases have you reviewed in that capacity as a forensic toxicologist?
I review about 7,000 to 8,000 cases per year.
And in terms of the work that comes into NMS Labs, are there a variety of agencies that submit samples to NMS Labs for testing?
Yes, we get samples from medical examiners and coroners. We get samples from police agencies for DUI cases. And we also get a lot of clinical samples from hospitals and referral laboratories.
So in that capacity, does NMS receive both post-mortem or death-related samples as well as samples from living patients?
Yes, we do.
And NMS as a lab, approximately how many tests or samples does NMS receive for testing each day?
We receive about 12 to 1,300 requisitions each day.
And when you say requisitions, what is that?
It would mean requests for testing. It could be multiple samples on a requisition.
So thousands of tests a year.
Thousands of tests a day. Yeah.
Tens of thousands of tests a year. My math is bad. All right. Is NMS a licensed and accredited lab?
It is.
And does that include national accreditations as well?
National and state accreditations.
I'm going to turn to your work in this particular case. Did NMS Labs receive some samples for testing from the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office related to George Floyd?
We did.
And were there a number of different samples that were received?
Correct.
What were the samples that were ultimately tested by NMS Labs?
So we tested the samples that were requested by the Hennepin County Medical Examiner to be tested. So we tested samples that were labeled as hospital blood, and we also tested urine that was collected at the autopsy.
And in terms of the testing that was performed at NMS Labs, were those tests pursuant to standard operating procedures at the lab?
Yes, they were.
And that process was followed for all of those tests?
Yes.
Getting to the results from that testing, what were the notable findings from that testing?
So the most notable findings in the hospital blood was the presence of fentanyl at 11 nanograms per milliliter. And then the metabolite of fentanyl, the breakdown product of fentanyl, norfentanyl, at a concentration of 5.6 nanograms per milliliter. In addition, we found methamphetamine at 19 nanograms per milliliter.
So I'm going to talk about each of those substances one by one, and you indicated these were the results from the hospital blood in this case. Is that right?
That's correct.
So let's start with methamphetamine. What is methamphetamine?
So methamphetamine is a central nervous system stimulant. It can actually be prescribed. It rarely is, but it can be prescribed under the brand name Digoxin, and it is used for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and also obesity. It was also experimentally used for treatment of narcolepsy. And between 2016 2018, there were about 10,000 prescriptions in the U.S. written for Digoxin that year, each year.
So can methamphetamine be both a street-level recreational drug and also a prescription drug?
It can.
With respect to the results, the 19 nanograms per milliliter that you found of methamphetamine, what significance, if any, is there to that amount?
Well, that is actually approximately the amount that you would find in the blood in somebody that was given a single dose of methamphetamine as a prescribed drug.
So when you say, you described the prescription drug form in which methamphetamine can be available, the results would be consistent with the prescription dose of that, is that right?
Yes, it could be.
Would that be considered a low level of methamphetamine?
Yes, very low.
And you also talked about the fentanyl results of 11 nanograms per milliliter. First, what is fentanyl?
So fentanyl is a opioid and analgesic. It's used similar to morphine. It's much more potent than morphine. It can be used to treat pain and also be an adjunct use in surgery and for anesthesia.
And you talked about opioids. Maybe you could just describe what an opioid is.
So opioids are actually include both natural, semi-synthetic, and synthetic drugs that act on a mu receptor, which are where opioids act. Opiates are natural products that are found in the poppy plants, such as morphine and codeine. So opiates are opioids, but not all opioids are opiates.
So what are some examples of opioids?
So fentanyl would be an example of an opioid.
Would oxycodone also be an opioid?
Yes, it would.
And then you talked about similarities between opioids and opiates. Is that right?
Yes.
And you mentioned morphine as an opiate.
Yes.
Is that heroin?
So heroin is actually made from morphine, but when heroin breaks down, it breaks down into a metabolite called 6-acetylmorphine, and then eventually to morphine.
So heroin would break down into 6-acetylmorphine and morphine, is that right?
Yes.
Do opioids and opiates have similar effects?
Yes.
Getting back to the fentanyl level in this case, you mentioned it was 11 nanograms per milliliter. Can fentanyl levels vary widely depending on an individual?
Yes, they can.
And why would that be?
Because of tolerance.
And could you just explain how an individual's drug tolerance might affect the impact a particular drug, like an opioid or fentanyl, might have on them?
So, I mean, if a person becomes tolerant to a drug, you need to have more and more of the drug to get the desired effect. So, with chronic use, to get the same feeling that you would at a given concentration of fentanyl, you need to take more to get that effect.
And so if someone is regularly using opiates or opioids, would that individual then develop a tolerance to an opioid like fentanyl?
Yes.
All right. Now you also talked about norfentanyl. Could you just describe what norfentanyl is?
So when the body gradually eliminates fentanyl, it breaks it down from fentanyl to norfentanyl. That's a gradual process that occurs over time. And it's one of the ways the body eliminates fentanyl.
And you indicated that the amount of norfentanyl found in the hospital blood in this case was 5.6 nanograms per milliliter, is that right?
Yes.
And what is significant about that amount of norfentanyl?
Well, it shows that some of the fentanyl was metabolized to norfentanyl. It also could mean there was pre-existing norfentanyl with additional fentanyl given on top of that. But it basically shows that when we see very recent deaths with fentanyl, we frequently see fentanyl with no norfentanyl whatsoever, because after a very acute fentanyl intoxication, the body doesn't have time to break it down.
And you described when you see a fentanyl overdose, typically you may not see any norfentanyl or low levels of norfentanyl.
Correct.
In addition to those findings from the hospital blood, were there some other findings as well that were included in your report?
There were some incidental findings. I believe there was cotinine, which was from smoking. There was caffeine. There was evidence of prior marijuana use by the presence of cannabinoids. I would have to look at the report to know.
And would that refresh your recollection?
Yes.
If we could put on the screen, just for the witness's recollection, Exhibit 624, please. And then if we could zoom in on the positive findings portion. All right. Referring to your report now, could you describe the other findings with respect to this case?
Yeah, so the additional finding was a compound called 4-ANPP. That is actually a precursor to fentanyl manufacturing, but it is also a metabolite of fentanyl. It's not pharmacologically significant. That's probably mostly inactive, but it was measured as part of some additional testing that was requested by the Hennepin County Medical Examiner. And then in the urine findings, we had presumptive positive findings, not confirmed for cannabinoids, amphetamines, and fentanyl. Those were not confirmed because they were present in the blood, so that follows that. And then we also had findings for opiates in the urine, and we were asked to confirm those, and we found a concentration of morphine in the urine of 86 nanograms per milliliter.
Apologies. Sorry, you were saying that you found morphine in the urine of 86 nanograms per milliliter. Is that right?
Correct.
And was that morphine found in the blood?
No, it was not.
And can a finding of morphine in the urine be indicative of a prior use in advance of a time of death?
Yes, it can. You can see morphine in the urine for several days, depending on the dose and prior use pattern.
And again, is that because it shows up in urine longer than blood?
Yes.
So you tested both hospital blood as well as the urine. You described the findings in the urine with respect to morphine. You were also discussing the 4-ANPP finding in the hospital blood. With respect to the other findings in your report, can you just sort of summarize what they were and whether they were significant at all?
So I think I mentioned, so there was caffeine, which is present in many of us, and cotinine, which is present as a metabolite of nicotine from smoking. And then cannabinoids, there was delta-9 THC at 2.9 nanograms per milliliter, and its breakdown product 11-hydroxy delta-9 THC at 1.2 nanograms per milliliter, and then the inactive delta-9 carboxy THC at 42 nanograms per milliliter.
And when it comes to these THC findings or THC findings relating to cannabinoids, what, if any, impact does that have?
It's very hard to interpret those, given the nature of the samples, and also what happens with cannabinoids, because they go into the fat, so they can be released slowly with time, and certainly, anything like CPR or something like that's potentially going to release THC from the fat. So it doesn't really mean a whole lot other than cannabinoids were used at some point in time.
So they can remain in the system and be detected for an extended period of time. Yes. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. We can take that down. Thank you. Now, as part of your testing process at NMS Labs, were there also some metabolites or other substances that were detected as part of the testing, but below your lab's reporting limits?
So we did find substances that were below the threshold to report, and that is why they're not on the report. But they are in part of the data package that was requested, and one can see those there.
And do you keep those litigation packages or that data as part of your standard operating procedures or the course of business at NMS Labs?
So all of the data is part of the course of business. The litigation package is actually pulled from that data on request, but yes.
So as part of your testing, the lab's testing of the samples in this case, I'd like to ask about the testing process for methamphetamine and whether there were findings of amphetamine.
Sure. So when we had a positive, the screen was positive for methamphetamine by a method called LC time of flight mass spectrometry. And anything that's positive above a certain threshold by that procedure is then confirmed by an alternate procedure. In this case, methamphetamine was positive on a screen, and we ran the confirmation test for amphetamines. The amphetamines confirmation test actually consists of 10 compounds, but we're only interested in the target compounds that we are actually confirming in this case. So in this case, we did detect methamphetamine, and because it's a metabolite of methamphetamine, there was evidence of amphetamine, but it was below the reporting limit, so it was not reported.
And you indicated that amphetamine is a metabolite of methamphetamine, is that right?
Correct.
And does that mean then that the body breaks down methamphetamine into amphetamine over time?
Yes, it does.
In addition to confirming the presence of amphetamine, was there also an indication on initial testing of buprenorphine?
There was an indication on the LC time of flight screen, but because it was below the reporting limit, it was not confirmed, so it's merely an indication.
And when you say indication, that just means it didn't go through that second step of the process, is that
Correct.
right? What is buprenorphine?
Buprenorphine is a drug that's prescribed. It's called Suboxone, and it's typically prescribed for opioid agonist therapy for people that are going through opiate treatment.
And are the components of Suboxone both buprenorphine but also naloxone?
Yes.
And is naloxone essentially generic Narcan?
Yes.
Getting back to the blood that was tested in this case, you indicated that it was hospital blood, is that right?
That's correct.
What's significant about using hospital blood for testing?
Well, hospital blood is if it's antemortem blood, is more representative of what is actually circulating in the body prior to the time of death. After death, there are changes that occur with drug concentrations, particularly in central blood, such as blood collected from the heart. And that phenomenon is known as postmortem redistribution, where drugs go from areas of higher concentration to a lesser concentration. That is less of an issue with peripheral blood samples, such as femoral blood, but it can still occur. So it's Ideally, you would want to try to get a sample as close to the time of death as possible.
And if a blood sample is taken after death or after extensive CPR on a patient, can there be some postmortem redistribution?
I think that's possible. There's a lot you don't know, but it certainly is possible, and if it does, it tends to increase concentrations.
When you say increased concentrations, does that mean that the level might show higher than it actually was at the time of death?
Correct.
What about hemolysis? What's hemolysis?
Hemolysis is the breakdown of a red blood cell.
And does that, or did it have any impact on the testing in this case?
No, I mean, that would have an impact on certain clinical chemistry tests like potassium, which is stored in red blood cells, but when you analyze a blood sample for drugs, you're analyzing the whole sample, so it would have no effect.
So you mentioned that NMS Labs receives thousands of samples a day, tens of thousands of samples a year. Did you review and compile some data from the year 2020 with respect to NMS's fentanyl cases and methamphetamine cases?
I did.
And would those help you to contextualize the results in this case?
Sure.
Your Honor, I would offer for demonstrative purposes Exhibit 920.
Any objection for demonstrative purposes? And what was the number again, Ms. Aldridge?
Sorry, Your Honor?
Exhibit number?
920.
920 is received for demonstrative purposes only, which means members of the jury won't go back with you for deliberation, but it'll be received to illustrate the witness's testimony.
And if we could publish. Thank you, Your Honor. All right, Dr. Eisenschmidt, I'm going to have you describe what's shown on this screen.
So as of right now, we're looking at what happens when fentanyl is metabolized over time to norfentanyl. So gradually, the amount of fentanyl starts to decrease and the norfentanyl starts to increase.
And that's what happens as the body metabolizes fentanyl, is that right?
That is correct.
Right, next slide, please. And could you describe what's shown here, please?
So this is data from NMS Labs from year 2000, and we looked at the fentanyl concentrations in postmortem cases, specifically in those, and only those, that were collected in peripheral blood. Again, for the reasons I mentioned before, central blood, like cardiac blood, can have a significant postmortem redistribution. So we wanted to look at samples that have a minimal amount of that.
I think you indicated the year 2000. Is this data from 2020?
Sorry, 2020, my mistake.
Okay.
So this is from the year 2020. And we had 19,185 cases that we looked at. And in the peripheral blood, in these postmortem cases, the mean fentanyl concentration, average fentanyl concentration was 16.8 nanograms per milliliter. And the median concentration was 10, median being 50% above and 50% below.
And with respect to peripheral blood, you indicated that you chose the samples that would have minimal postmortem redistribution, is that right?
Correct.
And why is that in comparison to this case?
Because the sample that we had of hospital blood is probably going to have less issues with postmortem redistribution than it would have had it been postmortem blood.
And in these cases that are represented as postmortem cases, are these cases that you would be getting from ME's offices or coroner's offices?
Correct.
And where the individual would be deceased or dead?
Correct.
Okay,
then
so
we also looked at the norfentanyl concentrations, and those were 6.01 as a mean, and the median down at 2.2 nanograms per milliliter.
So just to clarify, with respect to these postmortem cases, the average level of fentanyl was 16.8 nanograms per milliliter, and the average level of norfentanyl was 6.01 nanograms per milliliter. Is that right?
Correct.
Next slide, please. What's shown here?
So this slide shows some post-mortem cases with no norfentanyl, again for the year 2020. So out of those 19,185 cases, we had 15,455 that included fentanyl and norfentanyl, but there were 3,724 cases with no norfentanyl. There were 6 that were exceptions to that for reasons of testing purposes, but those were ones that were only fentanyl but no norfentanyl.
So does this slide indicate that there was a significant number, this 3,724 cases, where there was fentanyl found but no norfentanyl at all?
Correct.
All right, next slide, please. What's shown here?
So this is switching gears. We're looking at the DUI, driving under the influence, fentanyl concentrations that we found in 2020. So these are blood samples that are sent to NMS labs for people that were suspected of driving under the influence of drugs or potential other reasons of way they were driving. And in this case, we tested, we had 2,345 cases that were individuals that were alive that had fentanyl on board. Of course, other drugs may also be present, but this was specifically looking at fentanyl. And we had a mean concentration of 9.5 nanograms per milliliter, a median of 5.3, and then for norfentanyl, a mean of 5.42 and a median of 2.2.
And again, just to clarify, for these 2,345 cases, those individuals were alive, is that right?
Correct.
And you indicated the average fentanyl level, I believe, is 9.59 nanograms per milliliter, is that right?
Yes.
And the average norfentanyl level for those cases was 5.42 nanograms per milliliter, is that right? Next slide, please. And what's shown here?
So this is just a breakdown of the fentanyl concentrations we found in drivers that were alive. So almost the majority of them were under 5 nanograms per milliliter of fentanyl. And then we had another 26.3% that were between 5.1 and 10 nanograms per milliliter. And then the next set of data was we had 216 cases which were between 11 and 15 nanograms per mil. So that would be in the same area of Mr. Floyd's level of 11 nanograms per milliliter. And then we had several, quite a few cases that were even greater than that. We had 109 that were between 16 and 20, 81 that were between 21 and 26, 133 between 26 and 50, and then we actually have 53 cases in living subjects where the fentanyl was greater than 50 nanograms per milliliter.
So comparing Mr. Floyd's level to the driving population, where individuals were alive, his level was within a quarter of the pie of the DUI cases that NMS Labs has received. Is that right?
Right. He would be right in there with about the 80th percentile.
And you indicated that those levels for drivers were found in 53 cases higher than 50 nanograms per milliliter. Is that right?
Correct.
So those individuals were alive and essentially driving at that time.
Yes, pretty amazing.
All right. Next slide, please. And what's shown here?
So this is basically the postmortem concentrations or samples that were hospital blood samples that were submitted by Mr. Floyd, for Mr. Floyd, and we found fentanyl at 11 nanograms per milliliter and norfentanyl at 5.6 nanograms per milliliter.
Next slide, please.
So this slide shows what the ratio of the parent drug to the metabolite is. So 11 nanograms per mil divided by 5.6, the norfentanyl gave Mr. Floyd a ratio of fentanyl to norfentanyl of 1.96.
And essentially, does this slide show just the way in which you would calculate the fentanyl to norfentanyl ratio?
Yes.
Next slide, please. And what's shown on this slide?
So this slide shows the ratios of fentanyl levels between 9 and 13 nanograms per milliliter. So that range was chosen because Mr. Floyd's fentanyl concentration was 11 nanograms per milliliter. And when we do driving under the influence work, we actually assign an uncertainty of measurement to that result. So if a driver had an 11 nanogram per mil fentanyl present, we would report that as 11 nanograms per mil plus or minus 2 nanograms per milliliter. So I did this to see, well, what kind of ratios do we see between postmortem and DUI cases when the fentanyl level is between 9 and 13 nanograms per mil? What kind of ratio do we see? And we can see in the postmortem cases, the mean ratio of fentanyl to norfentanyl was 9.05 with a median of 5.88 versus the DUI population where the mean was 3.2, median 2.24.
And then just to clarify, in the bar that shows the postmortem cases, were there 3,088 cases that you looked at between the range of 9 to 13 nanograms per milliliter?
Yes, between 9 and 13 nanograms per milliliter.
And the ratio in the postmortem cases was 9.05 on average, is that right?
Correct.
And then with respect to the DUI cases, you were looking at 275 cases between the range of 9 and 13 nanograms per milliliter, is that right?
That's correct.
And so the average ratio within that group was 3.20, is that correct?
Yes.
How does Mr. Floyd's ratio compare to that data set?
So Mr. Floyd's ratio is roughly just a little bit below the median ratio in DUI. So in postmortem cases, we know fentanyl concentrations can be much higher than norfentanyl concentrations because frequently these are deaths due to fentanyl. Other drugs may be present, and there could be other reasons for the death. It doesn't say that these are all fentanyl intoxications. But just looking at it as a whole, with a large amount of data, this is what we observed. And we know with the DUI population, they are alive, but other drugs may be present as well. So it's really just to sort of look at how things look differently in the living and the postmortem population.
And does this slide also show that Mr. Floyd's ratio was below the average and even below the median for that found in DUI cases?
Yes.
All right, next slide, please.
So this slide is actually just a sort of a summary of the previous slide, but it basically shows the relationship between fentanyl and norfentanyl between the postmortem DUI cases and Mr. Floyd's.
And again, does it show how norfentanyl levels essentially increase over time in relation to the fentanyl levels?
As one lives and metabolizes fentanyl, yes.
Next slide, please. Now, did you also look at data with respect to methamphetamine for 2020 at NMS Labs?
We did.
And what's shown on this slide that's up right now?
So this slide shows the concentration of methamphetamine found in Mr. Floyd's hospital sample. It was 19 nanograms per milliliter. And then, as we talked about earlier, amphetamine was below the reporting limit, so it was not reported.
Not reported, but detected as part of your confirmation process.
You can see it in the confirmation data, yes.
Next slide, please. And what's shown here?
So this slide shows DUI methamphetamine cases with amphetamine and without amphetamine as a metabolite. So we had 3,271 cases that had methamphetamine in our driving under the influence population. 2,975 of these included amphetamine, and then 296 were just methamphetamine with no amphetamine.
And again, when we're talking about the DUI population, these are individuals, this 3,271 number, individuals who are alive, is that right?
Correct.
Next slide, please. What's shown here?
So this is a further breakdown of what we see in our DUI methamphetamine cases. So the mean methamphetamine concentration in all of our DUI cases was 378 nanograms per milliliter of methamphetamine. The median was 240 nanograms per milliliter. And in the 5 to 20 nanogram per mil range, with 5 being our lowest limit of quantitation, we had 192 cases between 5 and 20 nanograms per milliliter, which is in that range that Mr. Floyd's methamphetamine was.
And does this graphic also show Mr. Floyd's level of 19 nanograms per milliliter?
Yes, it does. It shows on the bottom, and again, 94% of the DUI cases that we tested had methamphetamine concentrations in excess of 20 nanograms per milliliter.
So in essence, Mr. Floyd's level was within the bottom 5.9%, is that right?
Correct.
Next slide, please. What's shown here?
So this is just a further breakdown of what kind of methamphetamine concentrations we have observed in drivers in 2020. And again, other drugs may be present. But in this case, we had 196 cases between 5 and 20, 306 between 21 and 50, 399 between 50 and 100, 571 between 101 and 200, 1,010 between 201 and 500, 578 between 501 and 1,000, and then an additional 215 cases that methamphetamine was greater than 1,000 nanograms per milliliter.
So again, you had 215 cases where the number was greater than 1,000 nanograms per milliliter, is that right?
Correct.
And the biggest piece of the pie, the 30.9% of the cases were between 201 and 500 nanograms per milliliter, is that right?
Yes.
So Mr. Floyd's level of 19 nanograms per milliliter, that was exceptionally low, is that right?
In relationship to the DUI driving population, yes.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
All right. It's a little unusual for you to be testifying in a death case, is not?
Not terribly. I mean, I do work with medical examiner and coroners a lot, but they typically are the ones that testify as to cause and manner of death. Usually, if I'm involved in a death case, it's usually drug delivery resulting in death.
Okay. And so you work in a laboratory that works with medical examiners from around the country, right?
Correct.
And you perform these services in a variety of different contexts. Agreed?
Yes.
So you testify that some are, clinical in nature, some tests are clinical in nature, some are law enforcement in nature, and some are death related, right?
Correct.
All right. And you, at the time you became involved in this case, you were obviously aware of the significance of this case, right?
Yes.
And your laboratory goes through an accreditation process, correct?
We do.
And part of the accreditation process is to establish standards and reporting thresholds, right?
Yes.
And so the reason a laboratory will have those thresholds is to be consistent in how toxicology is reported to various individuals, right?
Correct.
And so one of those accreditation standards is actually to have and set this threshold that if a particular chemical component is below that threshold, you would suggest not reported, right? Or you would say it's not reported.
So there are instances where a medical examiner might ask us if something was present below a threshold, and depending on what the situation is, it could be potentially reported as such. It's not common practice. In this case, we didn't do that.
It's not common practice to report things that are below, or chemical components below the threshold, because it's contrary to the accreditation standards. Agreed?
So it does depend on the situation, but by and large, there's a reason we have cutoffs, and if we go below those, it basically is not something we typically would do.
Right. So an analyst who comes in hypothetically and may see certain markers that have an indication that something is present, but refuses to acknowledge its presence, that would be because of those accreditation standards, right?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Hypothetically speaking, if an analyst from, say, the state crime lab comes in and a question is presented to her about the presence of a particular substance, but that substance was below the reporting thresholds.
I'm going to object, Your Honor. Testimony outside the scope, characterizing other evidence.
It's a hypothetical.
Overruled.
And that analyst refuses to acknowledge the possibility of the presence, right? That would theoretically or hypothetically be because of those threshold rules.
So I really can't speak to what is done in a crime lab because I don't work in that area. So for me, it's really limited to toxicology and the analysis of biological samples like blood or urine.
So, in other words, the reason we have these thresholds is so that we set the rules, right?
So the reasons these thresholds were actually established, it has to do with the original validation of the method. The thresholds are not set because of any standard that says this is what you have to use as a threshold. The laboratory establishes those and then writes SOPs in accordance with their validation for the procedure.
SOPs being standard operating procedures. Yes. And so if the laboratory sets this standard and says, here's the standard, and then does something in contravention or reports something that is against that standard, that would be a violation of the standard operating practice, right?
If it were reported without any explanation, yes.
Okay. So just a few kind of follow-up questions to your testimony. You've met with or spoken with members of the prosecution team several times, right?
Yes.
Including February 26th, March 5th, March 12th, April 5th, and April 6th?
That sounds right. I don't know the exact dates.
Understood. You wouldn't disagree with me if I told you those were the dates.
I wouldn't.
And I was provided with meeting notes and summaries of your conversations, right?
Yes.
All right. So I just want to make sure that I understand and the jury understands the difference between fentanyl and norfentanyl, okay?
Okay.
You would agree that fentanyl is the active ingredient, or when you report the fentanyl concentration, it's the active ingredient, right?
Yes.
Now, when a person ingests essentially any substance, controlled substance, doesn't have to be an illegal drug, the body metabolizes that, correct?
Yes.
And then the body eliminates that, right?
Yes.
Through the natural processes of the body.
Yes.
Right? And the elimination of the substance results in what's called a metabolite. Agreed?
Yes.
And so fentanyl being the active ingredient, norfentanyl is the metabolite or the breakdown, correct?
Yes.
And included in this particular case, you discovered a fentanyl concentration of 11 nanograms per milliliter, right?
Yes.
And a norfentanyl level of 5.6.
Yes.
Now, you testified on direct examination that could be one of two scenarios occurring there, right?
Yes.
One scenario is that a person took a certain amount of a controlled of fentanyl, and enough time had passed to eliminate that, correct?
Correct.
Or to break it down and have that metabolite
Correct.
being present. That's one scenario, right? The other scenario, as I understand it, is someone took some, that initial dose began to break down, and then the person took more, and so the active ingredient is there, but it had not yet broken down, right?
Correct.
So it's sort of either, and you describe it, I think, as an acute ingestion or a non-acute ingestion.
So, a person, when you have fentanyl will break down to norfentanyl, but you could still take more fentanyl. So you could still take fentanyl while the first fentanyl was breaking down.
Right. So, put it into context of people who may consume alcohol, right? I have a beer. My alcohol concentration is going to rise to a certain level, right? Whatever based on the alcohol concentration. Agreed?
Yes.
And my body will essentially immediately begin to decrease and eliminate the alcohol, right?
Correct.
But if I have a second beer, I'm adding more alcohol, causing my blood alcohol concentration to rise. Correct?
Yes.
And that's similar with all substances, including fentanyl.
In general, yes. I mean, so alcohol is eliminated at a fixed rate over time. There's only so much you can eliminate with time. With drugs, some drugs, it's a little different. But
Some drugs may be faster, some may
Right.
take longer, right?
Right.
And when you describe the results in this particular case, you're talking about, I'll strike that, sorry. So there's, based on a strict interpretation of these test results, there's no way to determine at what point any particular amount of fentanyl was ingested. Agreed?
I would agree with that.
Now, fentanyl, again, being a toxicologist, is a lawfully manufactured, controlled substance in the United States, right?
It can be prescribed as a fentanyl patch. It can be a lollipop. It can be used in surgery. So there's different forms
Right.
lawfully prescribed.
And the fentanyl that is contained in a patch or a lollipop or that an anesthesiologist may administer is in a very controlled and known manner, right?
Yes.
Now, when we're talking about the illicit street drugs that involve or include fentanyl, you have really no way of knowing what the particular fentanyl concentration is literally from pill to pill. Agreed?
Correct.
And so every single pill you take, it becomes a unique experience for the person, right?
That's true.
And so regardless of whether you have a tolerance or a non-tolerance, any single incident could cause an adverse reaction.
Well, sure. If you suddenly had a pill that was 10 times the amount of fentanyl than another one, then yes.
And you have no idea, right?
You don't know from pill to pill. True.
Right, because they're not manufactured in a controlled environment.
Yes.
Now, in terms of, you understand that there were some pills found on a floor of the squad car,
That's my understanding, yes.
and those pills were tested and contained the DNA of George Floyd, right?
I heard that, yes.
And presumably those pills were not in there prior to Mr. Floyd being in the squad car, right?
I assume not, yes.
And so you understand that as those pills were tested, those pills were at least appeared to be partially ingested or partially dissolved.
Okay.
And so there would be evidence of an acute ingestion of fentanyl and or methamphetamine at the time Mr. Floyd was in the backseat of the squad car.
Objection, Your Honor. Outside the scope calls for speculation.
Let's do one objection. Which one would you like?
Speculation at this point,
Sustained.
Are you familiar with the term hooping?
Objection outside the scope.
You can answer it if you know.
I don't.
Now, in terms of your slideshow, and I don't have an electronic copy of it. I can just- Some follow-up questions on some of your slides. You reviewed in 2020 a total of 19,185 fatal overdose cases, right?
No, they're not necessarily fatal overdoses. They were cases that were from medical examiners where we found fentanyl in a peripheral blood sample. But they could have been homicides, they could have been other drugs involved, so they were just basically random fentanyl concentration.
Gotcha. So someone may have been shot as a part of and killed as a result of a gunshot, but as a result of the autopsy process, they collected the blood and analyzed the blood as a part of the normal autopsy process, right?
Correct.
So the cause or manner of death being, gunshot wound, homicide, but we still look at the blood,
Yes.
right? Okay. And it was a total of 19,185, right?
Correct, peripheral blood samples.
So when the slide says 19,185 fatal overdose cases, you're not suggesting, it's somewhat misleading, I think, to me, because you're suggesting it's a fatal overdose case.
I didn't think it said that.
Well, we can,
If it did, I mean, that was something I corrected on the other day, and I said that's not correct.
okay. So just, this is, and I apologize for the writing, where it says fatal overdose cases, that's not correct.
Sidebar?
There's the jury. We're going to take our 20-minute recess. We're going to do a little work in the break, but we'll give you 20 minutes. Thanks. Any light to shed on this? What's going on?
Yes, sir. I received a bait stamp 49606, and apparently, and I printed it and I started working on my preparation. Apparently, at some point, I received an updated copy of this same presentation, and it's 49623. So it's like 17 pages later, and I'm just trying to verify when I received that, because I was using this as preparation. This was all last night.
Fair enough.
Your Honor, this would have all been provided in the same course of discovery. I'm not sure if it was the same batch that went out, but obviously the witness, during our witness prep, the disclosures that were made updates, the slides were updated, the updated slides were shown to the jury.
Well, let me stop it.
Not any prior perspective.
Let me stop. So I understand what Mr. Nelson has was an earlier version. Witnesses since updated them. You showed the jury during direct the updated version.
He has both, Your Honor.
Who has both?
Mr. Nelson has
No, I'm asking you. You showed the updated version to the jury.
That's correct.
All right, when was the updated version sent to Mr. Nelson?
I would expect the same day that the original version was, which was, my best guess was to April 6th, but I would have to confirm.
April 6th? So this Tuesday?
Correct, Your Honor, which would have been the same day that the other slides were sent. They just needed updates.
Well, I tell you what, let's take our break and let's nail it down specifically, but I think we can hardly, there's a lot of moving parts. I don't think anybody's I think you can just acknowledge that this is what you without showing it again, that you received an earlier version, it's been updated.
And that's fine, Your Honor. I mean, part of the problem that we're experiencing here is I'm getting these things in many of these items in PDF format, right? Some of them I'm getting electronically from, there's so many people involved here that I'm getting things in different formats. So if I can have a second to speak with Ms. Voss.
Yeah, I guess it just seems like there's a good faith passing in the night of different versions, and nobody should be criticized, or again, let's just tell the jury this is the latest one and this is what it is.
And that's perfectly fine, Your Honor, and I am happy to provide an extra copy. We are happy to provide and republish the slides that were presented to the jury, but I do want to make sure that we're not showing the jury inaccurate information, that's all.
So it's my fault, Your Honor, because we received apparently the second version on April 6th, and I must have looked and just assumed it was the second copy of the same thing.
Let's just clean it up when the jury comes back, tell them that you were relying on an earlier version. The amended version is the one that the witness showed during direct examination, and leave it at that.
And perhaps it would help if I could get a copy of that.
Okay, work on it till we're done with the break. Let's reconvene at, where are we at now? About 2:40 or 3:40? 3:40. Thank you. just a reminder, still under oath.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Nelson.
Thank you, Judge. Thank you, Judge. I apologize. I was working from a previous copy of your presentation. But nevertheless, I want to show you, ask you a few follow-up questions on this presentation. In terms of the post-mortem fentanyl concentrations that your lab looked at in 2020, you looked at a total of 19,185 cases, correct?
We actually looked at a lot more than that, but I specifically chose a subgroup that was peripheral blood because, again, cardiac blood inflates things, and I wanted to try to do something that represents most accurately what might be found in a living subject.
Okay. So you were looking and focused specifically on the concentrations in the most equivalent type of blood sample that was taken.
To the extent that you can do that, yes.
Right. But in those 19,185 cases then, not all of them represent a fatal overdose, correct?
That is correct.
And so of the 19,185 cases, do you know the number of cases that would be attributed to overdose specifically?
Unfortunately, we don't, because we don't get the history on a lot of the cases or what the outcome was, or even in context.
So you can't determine which of these cases included something like a gunshot or included something like a heart attack or something else that would cause the death, right?
That's correct.
These are simply blood samples, right?
Correct.
And when you look at these blood samples, you say the mean level of these samples was 16.8 nanograms per milliliter, right?
Yes.
And when we say the mean level, you're talking the average,
Yes.
right? So if you take up all of the 19,185 cases, add up their levels, and divide them by the number of cases, that's the average, right?
Correct.
And the median being 10 nanograms per milliliter,
Yes.
right? Meaning that's just 50% of the cases have higher fentanyl levels and 50% have lower, right?
Yes.
And again, we can't differentiate what the actual cause or manner of death was in any one of these cases, right?
That's correct.
Now, in terms of the 19,185 cases, when you're looking at the inclusion of norfentanyl versus the exclusion, the vast majority of those cases included norfentanyl, right?
They did.
15,455 of the 19,185 cases.
That is correct.
Now, when you look at the DUI concentrations, obviously this is a little bit of a different type of a situation, right? People are alive.
Yes.
They're driving a motor vehicle, right?
Yes.
Presumably.
Or sleeping in one.
Right, I suppose. And here again, there were 2,345 DUI cases, right?
Yes.
The average level was 9.59, right?
Yes.
And the median level was 5.3. So 50% above 5.3, 50% below.
Correct.
Nevertheless, they were all arrested for DUI, right?
Well, again, as I mentioned, other drugs may be present, so this is just looking at fentanyl.
And so what we're really doing is we're trying to isolate and create some form of a comparison of Mr. Floyd's fentanyl levels and his norfentanyl levels to some sample of population, right?
Correct.
One sample of population we know is alive, right? Because they're driving a car. And the other sample, we have no frame of reference. Did they die from fentanyl overdose or did they die from some other reason? We have no context.
That's correct. All we know is they're deceased.
In terms of when we look at the ratio of fentanyl levels between 9 and 13 nanograms, right? Of the 19,185 postmortem cases, 3,088 of those cases had a similar fentanyl concentration to Mr. Floyd, right?
Yes.
Again, of the 3,088 cases within that range, we have no frame of reference or no context as to what percentage of those people died from fentanyl overdose versus some other cause or manner of death.
That is true. The only thing we have is a similar concentration.
All right. And so, statistically kind of speaking, it's fair to say that some of the 3,088 people in that category died of fentanyl overdose.
Yes.
And some percentage died of some other cause.
Yes.
And again, in terms of the amphetamine, the methamphetamine and the amphetamine, methamphetamine and fentanyl, do you find that to be an unusual mixture of controlled substances?
So I'm not very familiar with what combinations are being seen with street drugs. So we see a variety of controlled substances. We tend to see fentanyl more with cocaine or heroin than with methamphetamine, but that's just what I see. But I can't speak to what is regionally being observed.
Have you heard of the phrase goofball or speedball?
I've heard of speedball, yes.
Okay, but not so. Speedball usually being in like a fentanyl, an opiate, and cocaine, right?
Yeah, it used to be heroin and cocaine.
Heroin and cocaine. I'm sorry. And but you've never heard the term goofball.
No.
Okay. Now, in again this particular case, your lab also tested the pills that were found in the squad car as well as in the Mercedes-Benz, right?
Our crime lab did that, yes.
And you've reviewed those?
I am not.
Okay. But similar to fentanyl and norfentanyl, you've got methamphetamines, which is the active ingredient, right?
Yes.
And amphetamines, which is the metabolite, right?
In a tablet, or are you saying?
No, in Mr. Floyd's blood sample.
Yes, there was methamphetamine.
Right. And just generally speaking, methamphetamine is the active drug, and amphetamine is the metabolite of that drug.
It's a metabolite, but it's also active.
Okay. So, meaning it's, what do you mean it's also active?
I mean, it's an active metabolite. It also exerts effects.
So a person would have an effect from both of those substances,
Correct.
meaning an intoxicating effect,
Not necessarily.
but some effect.
Some effect.
Relevant to the DUI population, Mr. Floyd's amphetamine and methamphetamine ratio was on the low side, right?
So we didn't look at the ratio of methamphetamine to amphetamine with Mr. Floyd because it was below the reporting limit. It's not on the report. We didn't report it.
Okay. So you can't compare the ratio, but his methamphetamine level was on the low side.
Compared to the DUI population, yes.
And in comparison to the DUI population, as well as the postmortem cases, again, there may have been other drugs, as you say, on board,
Yes.
right? Okay. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Redirect.
Dr. Eisenschmidt, you were asked some questions about your lab, NMS, and the testing that was performed in conjunction with accreditation standards. Do you remember those questions?
Yes.
You were asked by the medical examiner's office to perform the testing in this case. Is that right?
Correct.
and NMS performed the testing that was requested, is that
Yes.
right? And did NMS follow all the standard operating procedures when it came to that testing?
We did.
You didn't report anything in your final report that was below your reporting limit, correct?
No.
But you maintain that data in connection with your standard procedures, is that right?
Yes, the result, the data shows what we found.
And why do you do that?
Excuse me?
Why do you keep that data?
Because we keep that in a normal course of business.
And is it important to have a record of the testing you did and the things that you went through to achieve your results?
Absolutely.
You were also asked some questions about the methamphetamine level that Mr. Floyd had in his system. You indicated that it was a low level, that 19 nanograms per milliliter, correct?
Yes.
And it was so low, in fact, that you wouldn't expect to feel an intoxicating effect from that level, would you?
I would not.
And in fact, so low that as part of your lab procedures, you'd want to rule out that it's not just a contaminant. That's how low it was, right?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, it's real, it's there, and it was confirmed.
And it was confirmed, part of that confirmation process was that the amphetamine at least supported that it was not just a contaminant. Is that right?
That's true.
But either way, Mr. Floyd's methamphetamine levels were lower than 94% of the driving under the influence population when it comes to methamphetamine. Is that
Yes.
right? You were also asked some questions about the fentanyl levels in this case. Obviously, depending, as you described earlier, depending on an individual's tolerance, a level of 11 nanograms per milliliter could have a different effect on a different person, on different people, depending on their level of tolerance. Is that right?
Yes.
And in your experience with respect to recent or acute fentanyl use, there are a number of cases where you would expect to see no norfentanyl. Is that right?
So yes, we do observe that in cases where we know something's acute, let's say with somebody that dies with a syringe in their arm or something like that.
And if somebody dies with a syringe in their arm, you would expect there to be little to no norfentanyl. Is that right?
Correct.
And why is that?
Because it's a very acute amount. It doesn't mean you could never find it because there could be previous fentanyl use, but that's just not our general observation in that kind of situation.
And in that way, the ratio becomes important. Is that right?
Correct.
And why is the ratio important?
Because that basically documents how acute the fentanyl was relative to its being broken down to fentanyl, or fentanyl, excuse me.
And so Mr. Floyd's ratio of 1.96, 11 nanograms per milliliter of fentanyl to 5.6 nanograms per milliliter of norfentanyl, supports that there was survival time after the ingestion of fentanyl. Is that right?
Sustained.
What does that ratio show you?
It shows two things, that there was survival time from an earlier dose, or there could be an additional dose on top of previous doses.
And again, the ratio is consistent and lower than the average ratio that you see for driving under the influence cases with fentanyl on board. Is that right?
Sustained.
What does that show you compared to the driving population?
It just delineates the difference between a population where, a postmortem population where fentanyl is more likely to be acute than in a driving population where it's more likely to be chronic.
And in terms of the ratio, was Mr. Floyd's ratio more similar to the driving population where people were alive, or more similar to the postmortem population where people were dead?
It was more similar to the DUI population.
Nothing further.
Any further?
How can you answer that question when we don't know the context of how people actually died?
Because we still looked at a large number of data within that population.
So you have no frame of reference, though, in terms of what did the person actually die from? I mean, what if of the 19,185 postmortem cases, 19,184 of them were gunshots?
That's not really a possibility, but
I have nothing further.
All right, thank you.